Hi, everybody. Welcome to part three of our online learning series. This one is Independence in Africa. So, this is the story of how Africa gets rid of colonial Europe. Um, Most of this story takes place after World War II. After World War II, something was developed called the United Nations. It's a group, it's a peacekeeping organization, similar to the League of Nations, if you remember that from post World War One. But this one sticks. This one is still around. There's 193 member countries, and the idea is to prevent any future world wars. So they have five stated goals: maintain international peace and security, protect human rights, deliver humanitarian aid, promote development, and uphold international law. If you look at the picture here in the corner, um, this is probably something you've seen on TV or seen on the news. All countries send delegates, send representatives. It's similar to the League of Nations. You would try and talk out the issue before it became a war. And if you look closer in their charter, one of their key ideas is that colonial people have the right to self determination. So, what does that mean? It means a person or a country has the right to control their own life. So, uh-oh, that's bad news for Europe. Europe is going to have to make their way out of Africa. Um, so the graph here shows the dates of independence for African countries. You can see some of them are significantly earlier than others. When you look at the independence of these countries, you can usually put them into two categories. There's peaceful and there's violent independence. So on the peaceful side, you have the Gold Coast, later renamed Ghana. They got their independence under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. The British didn't give up control easily, and Nkrumah organized the Convention People's Party. He organized strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, very similar to what you heard about when we talked about Gandhi. Um, and a lot of this came down to Britain, still recovering from World War II, was in no position to oppose any of these movements. They had their own problems. They couldn't worry about what was going on in Africa. And Nkrumah was jailed for organizing these protests, but like you see with a lot of civil disobedience, going to jail actually gave him more credit than less. He was elected to office from prison. He became leader of the country the day he was released. And Nkrumah worked with the British to develop a plan for independence in 6 years. So what you see here on the map is the order of that these countries gained their independence. So what you notice when Ghana gained their independence, this kind of opened up the floodgates. In 1960, Congo gained their independence from Belgium, which, if you remember, was a particularly cruel colonial power. In 1960, Nigeria gained their independence from Great Britain. Soon to follow would be Uganda, Kenya, and Botswana. And then in 1975, Portugal would finally surrender control of Mozambique and Angola. France granted independence to Morocco and Tunisia. Other independence movements weren't quite so friendly. For example, French President Charles de Gaulle, maybe you remember him from World War II, he refused to give up control of Algeria. His rationale was there were 1 million French settlers living there. Algerian nationalists started a guerrilla war, and France decided to get out. There was really no realistic chance France had at fighting this. But even after Europe left, things were far from good in Africa. Remember how Europeans tended to draw boundaries without regard to the ethnic people? Well, this caused significant problems when these countries got their independence. Violence erupted, in some cases, civil war. Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa would all see significant unrest. In Nigeria, there were three large, influential ethnic groups: the Hausa, the Igbo, and the Yoruba. These groups back then did not get along, and the result was a bloody civil war. So, again, not dissimilar to what we talked about in India. South Africa was another country of violence and unrest. Remember, this was one of the oldest European countries. Portugal had been there, the Dutch had been there, and Great Britain was there. Most of the government in South Africa was controlled by Europeans or white descendants of those Europeans. Black Africans began organizing against their rule. They formed the African National Congress. About this time, South African white folks, mostly ancestors of the Dutch settlers, if you've ever heard the word Afrikaners, that's what they're talking about. White ancestors of the Dutch settlers, they began pushing for laws to separate white people from black people, and this is called apartheid. I have a whole lesson all on apartheid. I'll tell you later, but just for now, know that that was racial segregation in South Africa. Apartheid translates to apartness or separation. The separation was brutally enforced. In 1960, more than 60 people were killed for protesting. Most of them were shot in the back. Another problem, Europe really never did anything to improve education and infrastructure while it was in charge of Africa. So when Europe left, there weren't modern roadways, there weren't modern schools. In 1960, the Congo had a population of 14 million people, and only 16 of them were college graduates. Europe left a continent that they stripped of its resources, and they left it not ready for the modern world. Also, the leaders left in charge were often not the best. A lot of them were seen as illegitimate puppets of Europe, of the former colonial rule. These new leaders were very much a mixed bag. A lot of them were educated in the West and they were capitalists. Some of them tried to turn their countries into socialist or communist countries. Some leaders in Africa advocated for Pan Africanism. So that's a vocab word. It means a belief that all black Africans, regardless of their ethnicity, should come together. They should unite. Um, where this story starts to take a really bad turn is a lot of the people left in charge were military strongmen uh, who were just brutal rulers. So I'll tell you three of those stories. Joseph Mobutu is where I'll start. He emerged as the leader of Zaire, what is now the Republic of the Congo. He first wanted to get rid of all colonial influence, and along the way, he developed a totalitarian regime, means government with complete control. He also developed our vocab word back again, cult of personality. It's the idea that the leader is the law, the leader is the government. He's completely lawless. He is the law and above the law. You can almost think of it as worshiping the leader. He is the total government. His face was everywhere. His portraits were on buildings. Just a Google search, I found all these pictures of him on the money. He held titles such as Messiah and Savior. The evening news started with a graphic of him descending from the clouds. His regime was so corrupt that a new word was created, and that vocab word at the top here, kleptocracy. So if you've ever heard like the prefix klepto, means like to steal. So kleptocracy, a government with corrupt leaders. I think of it, it's just a government that steals. Mobutu is thought to have stolen at least $5 billion. Some people say as much as 15 billion. Meanwhile, his people starved. This guy, maybe you've heard of. He's been in the news fairly recently. This is Muammar Gaddafi. He rose to power in Libya and quickly followed that dictator pattern. So, what do I mean? Well, he destroyed all opposition. brutally, and he developed a cult of personality. If you remember, Mao had his little red book, and of course Hitler had his book. Gaddafi had a book. His is the little green book. During his reign, Libya engaged in terrorist activities. They bombed a dance club in Germany. They bombed a flight, Pan Am 103. Uh, Gaddafi has used trained mercenaries to kill protesters in his country and brutally slaughtered some of his own people. The people in Libya had very few rights under Gaddafi. He's been famous more in recent times for his increasingly erratic behavior. Some people have questioned his sanity. If you notice, his appearance has changed over the years. Um, it's considered pretty common knowledge that he was using like Botox injections to try and make himself look younger. Other people suggested plastic surgery. He's known for a very extensive wardrobe. He's also known for his list of phobias. He didn't like to fly, which, as a world leader, made things difficult. He especially did not like to fly over water, and he always liked to stay on the first floor. When he would travel and they would book him hotel rooms, it would have to be on the first floor. He wasn't comfortable with anything of a height that required going up more than 35 steps. So if you think of our 44 stairs here at the high school coming up from the gym, for him it's 35 steps and that's it. He's also famous for traveling with 40 female bodyguards. So I remember Gaddafi fairly well. He was alive for most of my lifetime. What he was in the news for not that long ago was his death. In 2011, there was an Arab Spring moment, or I'm sorry, a movement. Arab Spring is anti-government protests and rebellions in the Arab world, and Gaddafi was one of the victims of this movement. What you're looking at on the screen, they're supposed to have found him hiding in this pipe, and there's different stories about how Gaddafi died. All of them pretty violent. All of them have him pleading for his life. In some he's shot, in some he's beaten, in some he's thrown off of a moving vehicle. Um, but I guess the end result is all the same. He's dead, uh, killed by uh, killed by his own people. The last guy I'll tell you about, a lot of people say is the worst of the group. This is Idi Amin. He's president of Uganda in 1971. Seen as very charismatic, seen as funny. Lots of pictures of him smiling. Very charismatic in interviews. People around him described him very fun to be around, but scary because he could change in a second. Uh, he played the accordion, but this wasn't the real him, or it was just a side of his personality, and the other side was brutal. Um, he was a very big, very physically imposing man, very strong, known as the Butcher of Uganda. When Amin came to power, he ordered a genocide against tribes that supported the local government. So, again, if we follow the dictator pattern, one of the first dictator moves is to get rid of all opposition, and you do it brutally. So as to set an example. Critics of his regime were shot in public, and sometimes these were televised. Often his victims were innocent civilians. This is a photograph of one of the televised broadcasts of one of his executions. Amin kept a torture dungeon where people were beaten. He even had one of his wives killed. So this is a picture of Mr. Amin's torture chamber today. And there's all sorts of stories about this. There's a story that he was a cannibal. Uh, I don't I don't know that that's true. I don't think that's ever been substantiated. Uh, but there's all sorts of stories of how brutal the killings were here. Um, how much of them is true, I don't know, but I'm sure it just added to the fear that any rational person would have for this man. He's thought to have killed about 300,000 people. That's one out of every 60 people in his country. There is freedom of speech, but I cannot guarantee freedom after speech. The people became increasingly fed up with Amin. He was in a car accident and taken to Egypt for care. During this time, he ordered the killing of several of his top government officials, and this seemed to be the last straw for a lot of people in the country. It probably didn't make sense to take him on while he was still in power, but while he was healing and while he was out of the country, soldiers mutinied and a new leader was put in place. Amin spent the rest of his years living in sanctuary in Saudi Arabia, and he's since passed away. So that's all I have for you today. I'm sure I have some other stuff on Schoology for you, so check that out, and I'll see you next time.